Hello, everyone. This is Apurva Narain, and I wanted to welcome all of you. I'm very, very thankful to all the participants of this session, and I welcome all the panelists and welcome all of you watching the program. I also want to thank Westland and Oxford Bookstore for hosting this. I'm not going to say much. I just wanted to say that I sort of consciously invited people on this panel who weren't so conversant with Hindi, primarily for the reason of kind of seeing how they look at a text, at a translated text in English, and look at that as an English text rather than as something that needs to be compared with the Hindi. And so for the same reason, I would be very keen to hear from you, all the panelists, rather than speaking myself in this session. I've done that several times over on these two books, and I wouldn't want to speak much. I would want to hear from you as much as you want to say or read. I'll just, Anjali Purohit will be moderating this session, and I'll just briefly introduce her. Anjali is a painter, writer, poet, translator, and curator. She has two books to her credit, Ragi Ragini, Chronicles from Aji's Kitchen, and Go Talk to the River, the Ovis of Behna Bhai Chaudhary. She's also the founder and curator of the Cappuccino Adda, which is an initiative working to foster a literary cafe culture in Mumbai and contribute to building a vibrant writers community. I leave it to Anjali to take this session forward and to allow all the panelists to make the points. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Apurva. First, I will congratulate you and John for giving us these two really wonderful books and in a way introducing us so well to the work of Kunwar Narain. I will not take too much time. I will just do very brief introductions because we want to listen to everyone who's here. So I will briefly introduce the five panelists here. Stephanos Stephanides is a Cypriot-born author, poet, translator, critic, ethnographer, and documentary filmmaker. His poems have been published in more than 12 languages. His fieldwork with the descendants of Indian indentured laborers in Guyanese villages and sugar plantations gave rise to various projects, including two documentary films, Hail Mother Kali and Kali in the Americas. His latest book is The Wind Under My Lips. Saikat Majumdar is the author of three novels, The Scent of God, The Firebird and Silverfish, a work of nonfiction, college, of literary criticism, Prose of the World, and co-edited collection of essays, The Critic as Amateur. He has taught at Stanford University, was a fellow at Wellesley College, and is currently professor of English and creative writing at Ashoka University. His new book, The Middle Finger, will be published next year. Priya Sarukkai Chabria is an award-winning poet, translator, and writer of 9 books of poetry, speculative fiction, literary nonfiction, translation, and as editor, 2 poetry anthologies. Her books include Andal, The Autobiography of a Goddess, Sing of Life, Revisioning Tagore's Gitanjali, Clone, which is a speculative fiction, and Bombay Mumbai Immersions, a nonfiction. She is the founding editor of Poetry at Sangam. John Water, Apurva Narain, of course, the initiator of these 3 fabulous evenings of sessions. Apurva Narain is Kunwar Narain's son and translator into English. His work has been published in several literary journals. His first book of translations was No Other World. He is the translator of Witnesses of Remembrance and the co-translator of the book under discussion today, The Play of Dolls, along with John Water, who holds an MFA in literary translation and has lived in India while researching Hindi literature as a Fulbright Nehru Scholar. His translations have appeared in Plowshare, Asian Literary Review and Words Without Borders. He is currently working as a research associate at the Institute of South Asian Studies in Singapore. Welcome, everyone. I now invite Stephanos Stephanides to inaugurate the discussion today. Stephanos, over to you.
Thank you very much for the introduction, and thanks very much for inviting me to participate in this dialogue. The work of Narain is quite new to me. It goes back to 2019, and I think it was quite fortuitous that John Vater sent me the play of Dolls and said, "Can you read it and write a blurb?" And I was delighted when I read the book. It wasn't just a task or a chore. And I was also surprised that such a great and eminent writer wasn't more well known in world literature. You know, I also, more than just really liking him, there's writers you like, but you feel you don't necessarily want to get to know as a person. But I also felt there was a friend talking to me. There was a likeness of sensibilities and minds. And when I realized he passed away in 2017, I just regretted having come to India so many times and not knowing about him to meet him in person. And following his literary journey, I also realized how the people he had engaged with was probably the ones that I had engaged with in my youth. So there's a kind of kinship there. So there's so much to say there. I really liked, the term embedded cosmopolitanism that was used by Ranjit in the talk earlier. And in fact, I had noted down that his is perhaps a layered cosmopoetics. I think the idea of the politics of cosmopolitanism is already embedded in the word cosmopolitan. But the idea of cosmopoetics, rather than the politics, really inspires me, because it's a sense of a primal force in language that we can only aspire to and never really have access to, that goes beyond the polity and beyond the borders of any language. And I think this is what fascinates me, by the fact that, well, first of all, it's a work of translation, but you also, like Blanchot says, sometimes translation is a sublime literary mode, because you always have a sense of another text that's come before, that you have to imagine what has gone in through this gap. And I'd like to turn quickly to perhaps, and we can come back to the idea of deep time and layered cosmopolitanism and the question of cultural memory and the long duration back again in the discussion. But I received this, I think, in the spring, and I took it with me on a retreat. And from the very first poem, although I went through all of them, but I kept coming back to the first poem because it seemed to embody for me his whole worldview and poetics. And also, we all read words differently, and the word amaranthine, which is quite a rare word in English, but for me as a Greek speaker, it resonated immediately because of its root in the Greek word mareno and marazono, which is a very Cavafian word. And then I realized he had also translated Cavafi into English, but I have no idea how in English the word mareno or marazi would have come through. So it seemed to me was a point of osmosis from his translator, that very often a translation takes place on a level of sentience and not always on conscious choice. And it seemed like it's his way of like tying up the whole meaning of the poem. I only read basic Hindi, but I recognize that the title was also the last line. So there was a turn in the translation to make this title into Amaranthine. So let me just read this, I think. And I mean, and I guess just other quick points is also what he says about language before I read it. I think what really struck me was, you have a language in which I learned to live. You think, so it feels, your words somewhere speak my desires. So the idea of having a language in which you learn to live is also perhaps the task of the poet, and the way we will our vernacular into being. So it's, I mean, choosing Hindi, but also being cosmopolitan. It means he's also willing what the language that he wants to speak in. And that really meant a lot to me, those lines, as well as the beginning, which sees this truth as a kind of unforgetting. So anyway, let me read it before more time passes. If I am the truth, nothing has been lost. Drifting about, if I return to the places I lived before, I can beget myself anew. Begin from a resolve again. As much right, as much real, as much primal life that does not perish. A sequence ever renewing, a will that neither yearns nor repents, nor is constrained to only keep passing by people and events. The void I contemplate covers that same worldly touch, which had liberated the lonely creator of his loneliness and had unleashed a bounty of life on earth. An unfettered now, an uncertain future, that I am, and all I can still be. If I don't let myself break somehow, holding on to others, a dogged courage, a brazen carnival. We have a language in which I learned to live. You think, so it feels, your words somewhere speak my desires. We meet sometimes in the shadow of wars, sometimes in tranquil forests, searching the most sentient codes of amity that are truly universal. We stand on the shimmering truce line of a covenant, sharp like the blade of a saber. How mysterious you touch, that I am, still as thirsty after living so much, still as desirous after having so much, still as unaware after knowing all, as unfulfilled after getting things longed for, again and again, and unending even after, each moment ending. So maybe I should leave it at that. I think that I've taken up enough time, and then we can come back to some of these questions together at the end.
Stephanos, beautifully read. Thank you. And really your concept of cultural memory is something perhaps we might want to come back to if there is time. It's something very vital today to be kept. Yeah. So thanks a lot, Stephanos. I now invite Saikat to.
Thanks, Anjali, and thanks Apurva and the organizers for having me and really putting together this beautiful series of events. Among everything I saw yesterday, I was thinking of this beautiful sort of short film on the effect Kunwar Narain's work, especially his poetry, had on potters and people who work with different medium. Got me thinking about that famous Ted Hughes poem about poets and potters. And it was really very interesting to see how the craft of poetry actually got translated into different medium, and how it influenced so many writers, so many artists from very different backgrounds. So I will mostly be talking from that perspective. I'm also, as Stephanos mentioned, a relatively late reader of Kunwar Narain's work, only have read his work in English, though I also read basic Hindi. But I'll be speaking, I don't think I can bring the kind of historical knowledge, say, for instance, Ranjit brought in his talk, but I'll be speaking more from the perspective of a writer who works in fiction and non-fictional prose, someone who also teaches writing, and how some of his stories were actually useful to me in his classes from the perspective of craft. That's why the craft evocation was very interesting. Now, when you read, and in this book, I'm really loved reading this book for many reasons. One thing that really struck me was that when you read these stories, they come across to you as very allegorical. There's an allegorical nature of the stories. And yet, when we think of allegory, we often think of allegory as a standing for something larger, something bigger, some kind of a human condition. Of course, Frederick Jameson has talked about the national allegory, and often the argument whether so-called third world writers are always writing national allegories. Can they ever write something personal? And so the amazing thing about Narayan's allegories is that they seem allegorical, and at the same time, they seem deeply local and personal. And this I find very unusual, as Ranjit mentioned, various influences on his writing, and I clearly could see the influence of the European absurdist thinkers. Obviously, many writer like James Coetzee, also very much a kind of a contemporary, later writer, those trunks. But it also took me back to some writers I know from Bangla. For instance, the writer Bonoful, Bolaichand Mukhopadhyay, the writer Parashuram, Rajshekhar Bosu, and the sense of irony, the sense of allegory, and that was really striking. And as someone who's been trained very much in Western literature and did his MFA from America and all that, I'm constantly struck by how Bhasha writers, especially Indian vernacular writers, are challenging the kind of notions of craft. There's a certain narrow attention, a very post-Enlightenment, post-romantic technical attention to craft we grow up with. Oh, you must have a certain point of view, the voice is important. And it's quite amazing how these Bhasha writers actually break all these rules and yet produce something really memorable. One thing I often talk about in my classes is that, so obviously there's these two entities, the concrete and the abstract. How without the concrete, a writer cannot create experience, but without the abstract, there's no understanding. So it's almost like using the telescope and the microscope, alternating between the two. And what I find striking is that Narayan's work, it almost seems like the concrete and the abstract are used at the same time. There's like this distance. It's really kind of close and at the same time very distant. I want to just read 2 paragraphs from a story I have actually used in one of my classes. It's the very first story of this book, the story called The Court of Public Opinion. The voice is so remarkable, and there's so many questions about it. So this is how it starts. Sadiq Mian managed to keep his motives in check at first, but then they went away. A completely new bicycle stood completely unclaimed, without even a lock to guard it. He glanced around once, then ran his hand over the bike's glittering handle, as if caressing the mane of a magnificent Arabian horse. He couldn't hold back any longer and jumped on the bike. No one objected, nor noticed. And well, what could the poor bike say either? He pushed down on the pedal lightly. The youthful cycle was ready to take off with him right away. The people nearby came and went on as usual, just as before. Sadiq Mian spurred the bicycle on, and it began to fly like the wind. It was his now. I mean, the voice is so remarkable, I find, as a writer and a teacher of writing, that there's a sense of whose voice, is the voice kind of judgmental? Is it ironic? Is it intimate? And it's an act of theft that is being described. But the act of theft is described with such charm, with such sweetness. And it's really very interesting story, because one thing you see in many of Narayan's stories are that dialogues are actually quite rare. He talks, and that's also the paradox, that he evokes the intimate. But when you don't have dialogues, that immediately creates a kind of a shadow, that it feels like it's happening behind a curtain. And in this particular story, the dialogues come right at the end. And of course, for those of you who haven't sort of read the story, it's really interesting that, what happens to the thief, and, the thief runs into this herd of buffaloes, and then the crowd is incredibly sympathetic, like, oh my God, you're hurt. And there's no sense that he's actually the thief. And ironically, what we see is at the end, the other section, the actual thief, and the person who lost the bike ends up getting a lot of the crowd sympathy. So that's the ironic title, The Court of Public Opinions. And you can see how, irony is not separate from affection. I think that's something I really like, that how these stories proceed. Many of the stories don't have dialogues. I mean, there are some stories which are a bit different. One story is the title story, The Play of Dolls. It again reminded me very much of actually Rabindranath Thakur's stories, especially the story Tota Kahini, that how, this is a story about this young girl who makes dolls, and the kind of affection and the kind of onslaught on the vulnerability of youth, and it's really very beautifully done. And again, reading someone like Narain, you realizing, like I've also seen reading Manto or Chuktai, not so much with Bangla writers whom I read in the original, but certainly when these writers come to you in translation, you realize that they kind of give you a curious freedom from the tyranny of craft, that as a writer, you don't have to follow certain rules. They seem very kind of arbitrary, and yet there's a kind of larger sense of the absurd, which again comes, which I think that we've been hearing about the cosmopolitanism of his writing, and that is very there. I just want to conclude by reading two poems, which I think really brings out this sense really well. One is from this book, Witnesses of Remembering, the poem Groundwork, a beautiful poem. I will read only the English. Another execution yesterday under peculiar circumstances. I went to a hospital. The place was not a hospital. I met a doctor there, but the person was not a doctor. He whispered something to a nurse, but the nurse was not a nurse. Then they went inside, an operating theater, but it was not an operating theater. An anesthetist was already there to etherize, but in fact, even he was someone else. Then a half-dead child was brought in, nor ailing, but starving. At the table, the doctor picked up a surgical knife, not a surgical knife, but a rusty, ominous dagger. Thrusting it into the child's stomach, he assured, now all will be well. I mean, there's this sense of doom, there's this sense of, kind of disaster, which is both at the same time, kind of classical Greek and existential, which really shows the kind of wide influence. And another poem also I thought was very moving to me, A Little Late in the World. I reached this world a little late, but then the whole globe had been civilized, all forces had been felled, animals had been slain, the rain had ceased, and the whole earth was simmering like an infernal orb of blaze. On all sides, dense, gigantic jungles of iron and concrete had arisen, and in them could be seen some people preying on other people. In the more modern and evolved of ways, I reached this world a little late. And it's a really fascinating poem. There's this almost philosophical critique of temporality. We've heard, I think, the last couple of days that Narain was very aware of time, the phenomenon of time. And this becomes a kind of a political critique of modernity. So it's quite amazing that, I think when we look at the micro elements of writing, the close, we sometimes lose track of the bigger one. So I think what really fascinates me about his writing is that even at the sentence level, there's a certain carelessness. And I've always told my students, it's only a great writer can afford to write badly. There's this carelessness about being sort of slavery to craft. And yet at a larger level, this embodied cosmopolitanism really comes across. And this opens a lot of possibilities for writers writing today. I think I'll stop there today and, we'll continue the conversation.
Thank you. Thank you, Saikat. That was such an informed and really the extracts that you chose to read from, also speak about how prescient he was. I mean, if one talks about the court of public opinion, mob mentality, the crowd determining judgment of a person or a community or whoever, I mean, it's totally what he wrote say 30, 40 years ago, that still is relevant for us today. So thank you, Saikat. I now invite Priya to please dwell on the book.
Thank you. Thank you, Anjali. Thank you, Apurva. And indeed, everyone who's here. Because, I mean, what shall I say? I've been reading these books, and especially the book of poetry, witnesses, not witness, but witnesses of remembrance. And what I can say is that it gives me a calm, it has a calm magic. My days open with a calm magic, thanks to this book. It puts you into a world which is immediately very close to you, and yet seems a bit distant because of all that we let ourselves be sucked in. You know, there is this difference. We can pull away, but we don't. And here is this world which is coming back to us, this calm magic that he gives you. And therefore, I thought I will begin with a poem called Poetry. And Apurva, I hope you don't mind if I read extracts. Okay. So here is a poem called Poetry. It's a poem in two parts, and I'll read very brief extracts from both. Poetry. It is not a declaration, but a witness. Sometimes before us, sometimes after us, sometimes ahead of us. That's a part from the first part. That's quote from the first part. From the second, it begins. It can give us a lot, for so much can be poetry in life if you give it space. As trees give space to flowers, as night gives space to stars. And here again, I mean, you see this collection of images that he's brought in, you know, the human, the other than human, deep time, stars, the fragility, the temporality, which, as I also spoke about, this queer of the flowers, this wandering is, and this marvelous vast mind, this marvelous vast consciousness is what I'm very grateful for, besides, of course, the craft, the artistry. And how do we, you know, and here we are trying to reach him, but how do we reach him if not through his words? It's like, I think, a bit like a river. You cannot place the river except for the landmarks on the banks. And we go time and again to the banks, the geographies of his verses through which we can gauge his mind's reach and the pulse of his heart, and indeed the flame of his consciousness, and be drawn into this world, which is very large. But before I go any further, I want to thank Apurva for these translations, because these are seemingly simple verses, and yet we know how difficult it is to translate the seemingly simple. And again, it's a water image that comes to mind. I was thinking of this mountain stream, Apurva, very clear, running, limpid, a lot of life, purity and movement, and yet all the time, it allows you to see the depths, the textures that are that hold it, the bed that holds it. So there's this beautiful quality in your translations, which I deeply admire.
Thank you, Priya.
And I haven't finished because I was really loving these translations. And also, you know, the way it's laid out on the page, and you see how very close. If I suggest all of you immediately go and buy the book, because you see how close it is. The stanza breaks, the line breaks in the Hindi and the English, how close Apurva has stayed to that, and yet brought it to us in a language which we share more than the Hindi. And I know this would have also been difficult because it's a relationship which is distant and undistant, as you have, you know, as is obvious. And that must have also required a lot of courage, a lot of pages, a lot of dedication too. So thank you for that too. And last of all, from one poet or one translator to the other, I love your use of punctuation, man. It just blew my mind. Every page is such a delight to read. You get it just right. So with that, I will read a poem, which is one of my favorites. But here again, it's so difficult because this book is full of, shall we say, favorite poems. It is really a magnificent book. But I chose Wild Roses because it has, not only for itself, but also because it says the dedication is after Werner Herzog's When the Green Ants Dream. And we know that Kunwarji was very involved, not just in poetry, but in the other arts, cinema. Not only was Satyajit Ray his pen, but he saw a lot of cinema. And this film, made in 1984, I think, by Herzog, the German director, is part fiction, part non-fiction, and brings together politics. It brings together cultural history that we've spoken about. It brings together re-memories. It brings together various influences. Also, how you speak truth to power, because it's based on this idea, of the green ant, which is a totemic animal for the First Nation people of Australia, who think that when it dreams, the world is wonderful. But then a Western company, a mining company looking for uranium comes in, and they are going to dig up this land, which means there could be disaster. This is what the film is about. And here is Wild Rose. The easy use of metronym here took my breath away. No, we don't want a life of opulent vases. Let us flower and wither our own way. Give us our jungles, our wilds. Do not sever us from our tree, our home. Let us adorn it our way. Beneath it, let us lay our own palette of petals. We want no charity, nor cruelty. Do not deracinate, nor clip us, or civilize us. Do not try to unravel us, created only from created only from color and redolence. We are a fragile reverie, weaned on thorns, wild roses. What a beautiful poem, and the way he gets the people in, coming there as wild roses. And oddly enough, soon after I read this poem, I saw a film of Herzog's, a more recent documentary called The Cave of Forgotten Dreams, which is about cave painting in the early Neolithic age. And there was this historian of early art who spoke about a couple of principles, which I thought was bang on. One, he spoke about the fluidity of existence of those people in that time. You know, when a tree can speak. And here again in this book, so often we have Narainji asking a tree the way to a rest house, or some other than human form, life form, to guide, help, speak to us. And that I found wonderful. And then again, the idea of permeability, which is what the early art historians spoke about communicating between the walls or beyond the walls that divide us. You know, the past and present, temporality and time, and also different life forms. And here again, there is this wonderful line in this book. There is only a curtain between looking inwards and outwards, you know, and this idea of wonder, how far and deep and vast his mind wanders, and the gaze, his gaze, which gets me to this concept, which I'm very fond of, which I believe in, Samadarshan, the level gaze of love, the equity of love, which I find time and again running through this book. In fact, I think it is the bedrock of this book. So with that, I will read excerpts from another poem, which is again, well, what shall I say, a favorite, The Estrangement of Bhartrahari. Excerpt 1. One could still live another life on other terms. By the way, you know that Bhartrahari was an emperor who was betrayed by love, and he could have killed off the people who betrayed him. Instead, he chose to forgive. So one could still live another life on other terms, a little more disconsolate, but far less cruel. I did not destroy them, though I could, he thought, but let them take what they wished, and so saved for myself a priceless world of so many possibilities. In camaraderie with nature, without hoarding or squandering, without gain or loss, with just the coming and going of seasons. And second extract, I wish to live that love immensely in eternal time, creating an eternal space, not torn by people and things, no trifling news from kith and kin. Standing aside, I wish to watch the world. I wish to laugh alone at myself alone, go on laughing so that tears fill the eyes, as if laughing and crying were the same thing, two sides of the same coin, a beautiful face on one side, on the other a forgotten date. Making his sentience limitless, Bhartrahari sees, like a sculptor sees a statue in stone, a poet sees a soul in a statue, a saint sees the universe in a soul, and neither the universe has a limit nor sentience. And may I just end with a very small, a few lines from one other poem. It is an extract from a poem, The Wish of a Leaf. Sitting in a park, I felt at peace. In the comfort of the tree's shade, I felt at peace. A leaf fell from the twig. The wish of the leaf. Now let us leave. Contemplating this, I felt at peace. And from myself, reading this book, I feel at peace. Thank you. You're muted.
I did, because there's a... After your reading, what it really needs is a bit of silence, but time will not allow us that. It was beautiful the way you read and the way you spoke. Thank you so much, Priya. It is time now to invite myself to speak. So here I am, and there's just too much to be said about the work of Kunwar Narain, which, you know, about what his work is deeply intellectual and meaningful, and on the level of it, you know, is so simple that people might think, oh, this, but when you read it again and again, you start understanding more and more nuances of his work and new meanings to what he has written. And honestly, these are two books that I will treasure, and I can't thank Apurva and John enough for giving us this treasure. So there are really so many aspects, like the cuts in a diamond, that one cannot touch on them. I will just perhaps mention three things that have affected me while reading both these books. Very quickly, I will go through it. You know, one could talk about allegory, as Saikat has mentioned. One could talk about the ironic, wry, deadpan way he puts across something which in fact, makes it even more, it heightens the effect of what he has said. But I'll not go into that. Two things that I would like to touch upon is that his work, both in poetry as well as in the fiction, is informed by so many influences that he absorbs, takes what is good of it, retains it, and then seeks another influence, whether it is of going backwards to mythology or looking forward to the sort of movements that he's seen, both politically, socially, as well as literary movements. He reflects them all without falling into any bracket. But what really excites me is that he was born in 27, I think, the late 20s. And so he has lived through so many very landmark and historic eras in India as well as in the world. And all of that he has reflected on, and they appear in his book. Say the freedom struggle, the new era of hope that India promised, then the rise of bureaucracy with a capital B, and the emergency period and after, and the latest, whatever has been happening. So, and also all the literary movements. So, some people might say, there's an effect of existentialism, but no, it is not. It's not. It is not. He does not feel a boredom. He does not think that life is meaningless. In fact, he finds meaning in life. And I feel this stems from, say, a philosophic ontology, a theory or concept of being, of existence, that reflects in his work, where he examines what is the nature, what does it mean to be, and what does it mean to be human, and from that stems what, like Apurva has also mentioned in the introduction, something that he wouldn't like to call humanism, because it has been given a slant where you have a pyramid where the human being stands right on top, and then the animal world and the plant world. And he does not believe in that. It's what Apurva has very nicely and succinctly described as humanesque. Humanesque, and I would add there is also humanness and humaneness. So that informs his work everywhere, and so deeply, and then out of examining what it means to be, comes his, what one would technically call his epistemological outlook as to what it means to see and to understand, which would mean that there is not one point of view which is the correct point of view. And there are so many ways of seeing a particular and experiencing and drawing conclusions from. And all of this, then his ontology and his epistemology, it leads to his ethical stand, which is deeply moral, deeply committed to see the human being not just for himself, but as a part of nature, which includes not only the animate world, but also the inanimate world. So in that context then, and so I would think also that what I find, and especially in his poetry, a detached engagement. He is removed, observing what is happening, describing it, and it seems like he's not involved in it. And then suddenly you find that he is so deeply invested in the feelings of that person, especially when he speaks about people or nature, who are not just marginalized. He has deep empathy for, I'm saying they're not even on the margins, they are off the page today, so his engagement with what that implies, how and why are they totally non-existent to the whole system and the powers that be. And that for me is something very, very crucial that I get from his writing. And that's why when Saikat spoke about the, justice of the crowd, I felt it is totally something that, and that would, I think, be a mark of good literature, that something that has been written and is relevant 100 years ago is still, relevant to us today. So speaking about the world which inheres in us and in which we inhere, I would like to, in fact, read one short poem called, talking about even inanimate things have life because they're there. Anyway, this poem is called The Door. Touching the door, it felt it also had a world like our all, a distinct solitude, a distinct life. It wasn't just a part of some wall, but also the vista outside, the heart inside. Its past too had the seeds of a tree, the legend of a grand forest, one tied up in servitude today. Even after being so heartlessly hewed and whittled down, on its body stood beautiful the wood grain of his pride. And it brings goose flesh on my skin, to read a poem like this. I will not go, there's just too much to talk, so I'll not go more into aspects of his life, but I would like to congratulate Apurva and John again. Actually, I'd like to have read Rally, but I don't think there's time yet. So I'll quickly also read this particular poem, which I feel exemplifies, continuing on what Priya said, and exemplifies the brilliant translation that both these translators have made. This particular very short poem, especially rhymes in an original language, say in Hindi, when you want to translate and you manage to do that so effortlessly in English, it is really remarkable. So this particular poem in Hindi is "Kahin kuch bhool ho, kahin kuch chook ho, कुल लेनी देनी में, तो कभी भी इस तरफ आते जाते अपना हिसाब कर लेना साफ, गलती को कर देना मुआफ, विश्वास बनाए रखना, कभी बंद नहीं होंगे दुनिया में ईमान के खाते." And in English, Apurva writes, "If somewhere there be some mistake or even an error in this give and take, anytime you pass by this way, do set your tally right. Forgive the oversight. Keep trust. The books of good faith will never close in the world." And with that very, very fond hope, I close my presentation and invite John to continue our discussion. John.
Thank you so much, Anjali. It's always very difficult to follow after one of those stellar poems. Like you said, you feel like you need to have a couple of moments of silence. I think that the title for this discussion to me is very apt, Undistances. because on the one hand, it touches on some of the sense of intimacy and interconnection that we see in Kunwarji's work. And also at the same time, it brings all of us together as part of Kunwarji's fan club to talk about our admiration for him. Interestingly, my first encounter with Kunwar Narain's work was not through his poetry or through his fiction, but it was through his translation. And I had a sort of attachment at Vani Prakashan, and I had come up across the book Nasi Maye Na Doriyan, No Limits, No Distances. And I was very struck by the author's thoughts about translation at the very back of the book in an interview. And it was through this book that I also first came into contact with Apurva and met the author for the very first time and my only time. And I think the experience was maybe somewhat similar to how Apurva translates his father's poem, Meeting Pablo Neruda, Warsaw, 1955, where there, his face brightened, what do you do, where do you live? And then the answer follows. So I'll be talking about translation a little bit, but I think, as Saikat had mentioned, this is an author who's very experimental, and he breaks a lot of rules, and some of the ways in which we think about translation, maybe from a Western or English standpoint, is not always the most appropriate. And I found it, very useful to look at how the author himself thought about his practice. I think that there were 3 points that he made in this interview I mentioned at the back of the book, which I found very compelling, where he talks about translation at the linguistic level, the cultural level, as well as the personal level, in the context of his own translations of the Polish poets, Herbert and Rosewicz. In terms of the linguistic area, he talks about the genius of Polish and how Polish can do certain things that other languages can't, and remarks that actually Polish is perhaps closer to the Hindi language than English. And he commented on some of the difficulties of getting English to work, according to some of the syntax and meanings of words in Hindi. Second, he shared something that I think a lot of us as translators know, that some texts are slightly more untranslatable than others. And he attributes this to, the degree to which it might be culture-centric. And as an example, he mentions Ghalib. And so, of course, we have many different people who have produced wonderful translations of Ghalib, and yet there is something which is, unique to the original. And then finally, he touches on something that Stephanos brought out in his opening remarks, which is that at a personal level, these 2 Polish poets resonated with his own sense of poetics. So I'll be talking about the stories. Normally, poems are called that genre that is, the most difficult and hair-pulling to translate. But the stories were also quite difficult as well, owing to the fact that it was a master poet who was writing them, and not only writing them, but also bending the form to show us something new about the world. And Anjali, you have discussed some of the ontological element, sense of being, that animates his work. So what was fascinating to me from the outside is his work seemed to be very culturally distinct and unique. And yet, as soon as I was reading it, I also felt, a sense of welcome and accessibility. And I think some of this is owing to the surface level, seemingly easy and formal prose. But I think to use the metaphor which Priya had shared, kind of like the lake, it's also because of everything that is down at the bottom of that rocky bed. And so for me, coming from the outside, I could sense the movement happening beneath the water, but it took quite a bit of effort to see, those stones underneath. So there are two texts I would like to share and read, which I feel kind of exemplify some of the unique challenges translating these stories and translating Narain. One is the story Fear. And to me, it was a very fascinating story and I think this has been touched upon, where he does this remarkable thing where he makes the intangible tangible. And this also overlaps with, I think, what he was discussing for the particular genius of language for Hindi. And I feel like what he's able to achieve in Hindi through that story maybe was a bit more, the language was more open to some of the signals than English was. And what I mean by that is in Hindi, you can do wonderful things like have an adjective and have saw, or see behind it to give it a bit of, effishness, or you can have a subjunctive, for something that may or may not happen. Some of the, just basic pronouns like waha or, yehe, they can be he or she or it. And so there are these wonderful things that Hindi can do, which can touch upon many different, levels. And it's appropriate for the story in which he's trying to zero in on the question of fear itself. And for those who are unaware with the story who are watching, it's essentially the story of an author who is sitting at his desk, and then this mysterious insect-like, sort of entity crawls into the room, and in some way takes on, the fantastical nature of fear, and that it keeps on transforming in proportion to the author's own projection of his imagination. So there's a dialogic aspect involved. And in translating the story, what was very difficult to do was to clearly convey what was going on while choosing verbs and nouns that maintain some of that sense of indeterminacy, because it would have been very easy to make it overly concrete, which would have been antithetical to what the story was trying to convey. So I'll read one quick passage so those who are unfamiliar can get a sense. Undoubtedly, it, which refers to this mysterious entity, continued to act so as to agitate me into pouncing on it, and thereby give it a chance to reveal some secret strength it had. It scattered the papers around with such callousness that my mind fired up with unbearable rage. I was trying hard to estimate its true strength, because by now I'd almost accepted that, by viewing it as weaker than myself, I'd made a fatal error somewhere. This conclusion had a negative effect on me, because for the first time, I sensed how intensely nervous I was. Until now, I believed I was safe from things like it, because I stayed far from them. But now I found that keeping my distance from those things held no meaning. It was only if they kept their distance from me that I would be safe. I couldn't pull myself up and rest easy, such that very tiny insects, which could be poisonous, wouldn't reach me through the chinks in my efforts. Nor could I make my defenses so strong that very large insects together wouldn't be able to break them down. How safe I am depended as much on me as on others, especially on the wisdom of others. And if someone refused to understand a person in terms of the person's humanness, then that person's misfortune would be limitless. So you see that there is a degree of abstraction and evaluation going on. And even the term limitlessness, humanness, has a sense of openness and infinity to it, which is somewhat unique. And then I'll just close very quickly by also touching upon the allegorical aspect, which Saikat mentioned, which was also very fascinating to me. Working on these stories, you can tell in some of them, such as the story Dubious Moves, that there is an allegory at play and it's trying to convey something. But for me, who comes from a more Judeo-Christian background, being able to follow the allegory and what the allegory is trying to convey is difficult. And that's made even more difficult by the fact that Narain is also not limiting it, to a single allegorical reading. And so for the story, Dubious Moves, it's essentially about someone who wants to do good in the world, and he gets drawn into all of the machinations of power, who want to, help him, but through help them just end up pursuing their own ends. And what was fascinating to me is that suddenly you know, the characters just pop into existence. Some of them are equated with being demons. There suddenly seems to be a sort of cosmological aspect at play. So what begins as somewhat like a noir story where a crook, you know, shows up saying, "Oh, I can help you with this thing," suddenly takes in the entire universe. And we realize that the debt that we're talking about is also the debt of morality, you know, that we owe to our fellow human beings. And there's a very fascinating character who is a woman in this story. And as the chess pieces move through the various stages, she herself transforms in a very interesting way, from being someone who at the start is very powerless to being someone who by the end is not only in a powerful worldly position, but even ends up kind of transcending the worldly bounds and shackles of the world entirely. And so just to close my part, I'm just going to read from the story Dubious Moves during this transformation into that something else. Her hair is open, eyes half closed. She's altogether mine. Even then, who knows why, I can't bring myself to be free in front of her. I only remain grateful, that's all. This appearance of her is not dependent on a mirror nor on time, for it is the magnanimous beauty of Atma, free of both, which had ripped open the dense, gnarled folds of darkness to suddenly illumine like the stars. In that moment, she has some singular power with the capacity to bestow infinite love. There are blemishes on her body. I want to wash them away with the dew fallen on roses, but the stains won't go. She kisses my furrowed brow. These blemishes have become a part of this body now. Without changing this body, there's no escaping them. But don't look at them. Look only into my eyes, where there is only you, only gaiety abounds, where there are no others. And with that, I'll pass on to Apurva.
Thank you, John. Apurva.
I don't know what, firstly, I want to just tell everyone that John got married just a few days ago.
Congratulations, John.
This is like a celebration of that as well. I hope this session. I don't know if I want to read things and talk much at length, because there's a lot of stuff which I could talk on, and I've written most of what I have to in the introduction and the afterwards to these two books. But I want to just respond briefly to the poems that all of you read and the stories that all of you read. Stephanos, you began with Amaranthine, and I think that poem to me presents a sort of, in fact, what I'm doing, Anjali, now is a sort of dissolving this into the discussion itself, so we can kind of move into the discussion from here straight away. So that poem to me speaks of a certain mystery and a certain silence and a certain subjectivity which is open to multiple interpretations. And that particular poem, I think, can be translated in several different ways. And I have chosen a particular way where I've interpreted Utna hi asamapt as Amaranthine, as you know, in Ranji's talk, he mentioned the idea of the will to live, which is what I found central to this this poem, and I kind of translated that into eternal will to live, which runs through the poem. And this, I would sort of conflate this poem with something like Inner Sight, which was one of the last poems that he wrote. And there's a sense of sort of gratitude and the sense of mystery and the sense of silence which pervades both these poems. Priya talked about poems like Invitation, which is one of my favorite poems. Actually, if I do have to read a poem, I'm going to read Invitation because it's really one of my favorite poems from this collection. Let me just, it's a small poem and I'll just quickly read it and then I'll get to the point I'm making. Invitation. A yellow shawl of sunlight on his shoulders, standing quietly by the street, a tree that looked like a person. I asked it the way to a rest house. It remained silent. I asked again, and still it remained silent. As I began to move ahead, it felt, it did say something after all. Maybe it was I who had not understood the language of one that was gentle like a shade and intimate like a rustle. And I'll just simultaneously read the last two lines from the story Near and Around Shapes. And I want you to just look at the parallel between these. But she who beats her head outside in pain, she is only the wind. She won't understand what I'm saying, but I exist because of her. Somewhat so that I will have to understand what she's saying. Rising quietly, I open the shuttered doors and embrace that primal, rugged tempest to my breast. So if you look at what's happening in this poem and in this story, and that's how I sort of gave this. I thought of this title on distances for this session. That this whole metaphor of bridging distances is very much present in both his poems and his stories. And here in the invitation, we are bridging the distance between us and nature. And there are all kinds of dualities that this author is bridging in his work. And I mentioned them in the introduction: the life and art duality, life and death, mind and reality, animate, inanimate, which you mentioned. I mean, all kinds of dualities. In this, it's between us and nature, and we kind of anthropomorphizing the tree and making it a person and talking to it, and there's a certain gentleness about this poem and many of his poems on trees and inanimate objects and beings and stones. And if you contrast that to a poem like Groundwork, which you read, Saikat, now that's a very there's a surreal, absurd violence in that poem. And you would see the parallel in Dubious Moves, which John just read. Dubious Moves begins like a fantasy, and then it moves like a game of chess, and it ends in a violent, absurdly violent, surreal kind of scene. And I find that same sort of stuff happening in a poem like Groundwork or Guernica or A Shop That Sells Peace, which is not violent on the surface, but is very violent in its inner connotations. And I often get the feeling that what Narain is doing in the stories is problematizing the very nature of human evolution, of human development. And he's kind of building up these situations through various sorts of stories. I mean, stories that are very poetic, like Near and Around Shapes, to stories that are more allegorical, as Saikat said, to fable-like stories, fairy tale-like stories, stories that are more witty and humorous, stories that are historical. But he's all the time problematizing the whole idea of human evolution and human development, which is sort of ingrained in how we've made transaction and exchange as the basis for human development. And when he comes to the solutions, I mean, solutions are tentative. He's not going to be giving us definite solutions, and no poet does that. But the solutions are tentative and paradoxical, but I think he's seeking solutions in his gentler poems. When I read the gentler poems, I read poems on trees and on stones and doors and the wind. I somehow get the sense that he's trying to look for solutions. Now, these solutions are not solutions. They are sort of moral truths. They are, if they're scientific truths, they are truths that keep changing the goalposts all the time. And so they are tentative in that sense. But he's seeking these solutions, and it's like as if he's doing this writing in prose and writing in poetry, and then writing essays and writing epic poems and writing literary criticism, all towards building a worldview. They're all different components of the worldview which he's building up, and which I've alluded to at large, both in the afterword to The Play of Dolls and in the introduction to Witnesses of Remembrance, and which is something that I'm writing more on, and I'm building up this theme for a symposium in Lausanne, which is about to happen. So this is one aspect that I wanted to touch on. Running through this is the moral imperative that Anjali spoke of, and this is this huge presence of the ethical and the moral in his work. And if you look at, again, the same two pieces that I read, Invitation and Near and Around Shapes, there is a moral imperative that he's alluding to, that we have a responsibility to understand those who can't speak like us. So whether it's the wind in the story or whether it's a tree in this poem, he's constantly trying to frame the entire conversation around a moral imperative, which I find very fascinating in several of the poems in this book, at least. I mean, his earlier, as I said, his earlier work was very different. Earlier work was complex in its construction as well. But here, the simplicity is very, very deceptive. I mean, it's very easy to lose the layers in the simplicity of the language, and therefore one has to keep sort of keep track of these things that he's doing at a larger level, at the level of a worldview. In wading through these stories in these poems. The other dimension I wanted to touch upon was the idea of time and history and mythology in his work, but I think Ranjit has already spoken on that just before us, and I'm not going to delve too deeply into it. But again, I think what he's doing there is bridging distances. So there's something to be said about bridging distances in Narain's work, whether it's as I said, the sort of dualities that I mentioned, or in this case, between past and future, between tradition and modernity. Now, if you look at a poem like An Evening in Golconda, and then if you look at a story like The Mughal Sultanate and the Bishti, he's trying to do the same sort of stuff there, that he's bringing a certain past into the present. He's not glorifying the past, he's not glorifying mythology, but what he's doing is bringing it into the present and making it relevant for our times. And he does it, he moves across time very, very sort of easily, I mean, casually even, and it kind of destroys our whole notion of time as past, present, and future. It demolishes that wall down. Well, I don't, as I said, I could speak on so many things, but I don't know. I mean, we're running out of time as well. And if there's anything that you want to talk about, let's do that. I mean, these are some points that I wanted to make in the context of the title for this whole session, and some of the poems and stories that you all spoke on, and then I just wanted to react to that. Anjali, how do we move?
Thank you, Apurva. Yes, now we open the discussion to everyone here. Before that, I don't think there are questions. There have been comments from Terence Miazek, Nabina Das about wonderful selection of readings, and Terence is congratulating Apurva and John for translating these short stories into English. But yeah, now, I mean, we could go one by one, or could just jump in with your comments. I think Stephanos, you wanted to dwell on something that perhaps you had left out. Would you like to speak?
I think you have to.
Muted. You're muted. Stephanos, you're muted. Or maybe he's.
Is it okay now?
Yes, yes.
Back unmuted.
Yes, you're there, yeah.
Yeah, no, I just want to say that how much everyone's comments and readings kind of resonated with each other in a way that was really meaningful, and gave new points of reflection. And this idea of bridging distance has also made me think of the question of close and distant readings, which is inevitable in world literature. We read things closely and at a distance, and how both are really necessary. I mean, there's been a debate, like, no, world literature means you're only reading something that's been mediated from afar, and others insist on close reading. But the two are, in a sense, not separate. You cannot separate the two. I think we do that all the time as we read, that this idea of bridging is also how we think through the gap. And there's always a way of thinking through the gap, even if you're reading something that's supposedly an original. If you read the original Hindi, it's also a whole context from which this language came out and what's behind it. So you're always thinking through the gap and its multiple possibilities. And I think he's very good at making that turn as well in the gap and showing the underbelly. I mean, what really also impressed me was his response, again back to Cavafi, his response to waiting for the barbarians. And he turns it upside down and says the barbarians have arrived, and now what do we do? So Cavafi's problem was, well, the barbarians have not arrived, and he's saying, well, they're here, now what do we do? So I think he's always on that razor's edge between who we are, who the self is and who the other is. And that's and the process of being and becoming, and how we do this through language and the limitations of language, that we're using language to go beyond language. And I found this, the translations are very aware of this, as it also showed in what they said about commenting themselves and everyone's comment. It's the dynamic process that is more important than the actual product itself. That each moment has an end, but it's also a new beginning, and it's this ceaselessness of being and becoming that it's always fluctuating, and it also very different levels and different modes. So anyway, I mean, he's very quickly become, even at this late in life, he's become one of my favorite poets, I have to say, and thank you for bringing him home to us on this, even on this distant Mediterranean island. I very much feel at home with his books on my bedside table.
Beautiful, beautiful, Stephanos. Thank you. Saikat, would you like to add something quickly?
Just picking on Stephanos' notion of home and the world, I think what really strikes, and which I think came together in so many things we said, that, you know, there's a sense of feeling at home and at the same time feeling alienated. I think John also brought it up, the sense that you feel there's something different, and then when you read it, and the play of simplicity and deception. I think much of that goes back to something we've all talked about, that, you know, Narain's capacity to assimilate so many influences. And that's really remarkable, that, you know, that he's writing, but there's so many influences. I think throughout these 2 days, we've talked a lot about so many of his influences, both Western and Indian. And that is really striking. And this is, I think, where the translation, I think Apurva and John's translation really have achieved something really special. Because I remember when I first read Ramanujan's translation of Anantamurti Samskara, I was like sort of like, oh, this doesn't look like a good book. It doesn't feel like. And then I realized that my sense of unease with the craft actually is a way of sort of raising a question of the kind of craft I've been trained in. And that is, again, a very Western, very post-Enlightenment, very post-romantic, very new critical definition of craft, a very Joycean notion of craft. And so when I actually came across Anantamurti, and I felt that later with Manto, that they really challenge and destabilize this notion of craft. And I think, you know, for a writer, for a novelist who writes in English, but who also obviously comes from India among these traditions, it's a very valuable lesson that in some ways our Western training kind of alienate us from and we find things awkward when anything deviates from it. But the interesting thing is, you know, when reading these stories, I didn't feel that. I felt, and this could be had a lot to do with the fact that, you know, we've matured as writers, you know, kind of time goes on, but there was this sense familiarity. And yet, as you get deep inside, there's a sense of unease that this is not what you think. And this dialectical quality about Narain's writing, that it's familiar, but it's alien. It's concrete, but it's abstract. It is close, but it's distant. It's allegorical, but it's personal. And that I think is very remarkable. And this is what really, sort of will stay with me. I've seen this quality, as I mentioned, in some of Rabindranath Tagore's stories, that this allegorical quality, and yet it's very personal. It's not use of dialogues. So I think this is something really remarkable, and I think it'll stay with me. And thanks again for John and Apurva for really making the experience so seamless. And I know Apurva wanted to bring us together as people who really haven't experienced him in Hindi. And my experience through him is entirely through these translations. And that is a really, powerful impact that it has left on me. So thank you again for that.
Thanks, Saikat. Priya, John, would you like to conclude, or because kind of time is running out, but if you want to have some quick concluding remarks, Priya? You're muted.
I think we've all spoken about bridging distances, bridging time, bridging influence, bridging the human and the non-human. And that, for me, remains very important. And we've also spoken about the moral imperative. And here, I think his whole thrust, in a way, is to get the human to be humane, just the adding on of the E, as it were, a shift in the worldview. I think his writing is working towards that. And with that, I shall leave my comments and just express my gratitude for this wonderful evening, this wonderful writer, and your translations, both of you, John and Apurva. Thank you.
Thanks, Priya. John, would you like to quickly conclude, and then we go to Apurva?
Yeah, I only have a few brief points, but I've been very excited by the conversation. I can tell everybody, you're all very deep readers and very concerned about both literature as art, and also the technical aspects of the craft. One of the things that Saikat said kind of excited me quite a bit, which has to do with some of the freshness and unconventionality of some of the Bhasha or Indian language writers. And I think this is, one of the things which initially drew me to reading Hindi writing and Narain's work in particular. I do think that there is a need to kind of smash some of the previous conceptions that we have about genre and what a story can do, because by doing that, we're actually opening up, a mode of conversation around culture, which we otherwise maybe couldn't have, or if not culture, what Apurva would call worldview. And then I think, secondly, for just to go closer to the question of craft, what I found to be very interesting about the way that Narain opened his stories was that, normally in the opening story, who, what, when, where, why, catch attention, get us into the drama. But I found that a lot of Narain's openings were a little bit slower, and often they kind of posed a question or a problem. And so in that sense, I think as someone commented, there may be a little bit closer to fables. And then finally, as regards how I kind of feel about the work, Apurva brought up, how Narain looks toward, trees and poems like Invitation as tentative solutions or sort of moral imperatives. And one of the kind of enigmatic things to me about this writer is, if I again kind of return to this metaphor of a pond or a lake, there is a shimmering surface there. And I think that, he's aware of all of the love and light and beauty in the world. And yet when I translate and read his stories, I'm also deeply aware of a very dark patch of a lake that's down there too. And I think he's quite aware also of, some of the injustices which are committed in the world. And I think it's this duality that makes him such a profound poet and writer for me. That's all I have to say.
Thanks, John. Actually, now we have a question and a deep comment, but really I don't think we can address it because we're completely out of time, and Apurva has to, and really maybe Ivan could go to the Facebook wall and reply to those questions there later. I conclude and say a big thank you to everyone for really, I'm going to watch this recording again to learn from what all of you have said. Thank you so much. And I hand over the screen now to Apurva to sort of, or he has some announcements to make and to conclude this session. Apurva.
Thanks, Anjali. Not much to say really, except to thank all of you. As John very correctly said, they're really deep readers, and I really appreciate your delving into the work with such patience and depth. And that's what the stories and poems of Narain demand. They demand patience and from his readers, and I think all of you've done 100% justice to that. So thank you, all of you. I mean, all the panelists, I don't have words to thank you enough. I would also like to take this opportunity to thank all the panelists and artists and writers and collaborators and filmmakers from over the last 3 days who've been so enthusiastically and gracefully participating in this whole series of events. And I'd just like to thank all of them. Finally, this session was partly about translation as well, and I think Stephanos referred to it. You're also bridging distances between the original and the translation. Here we're doing it from one language to another language, from the Hindi to the English. But what we'll do now is leave you with examples of what might be called intersemiotic translation. We've already seen one example of it yesterday of poetry into ceramic artworks. Now from 8 onwards, we have a film which is translating the poem An Evening in Golconda into cinema or a film, which is also shot on location. So I would call it a faithful translation of the poem. Then we have very small excerpts from a concert that was held 2 years ago, a physical concert, by Shubham Mudgal at the India International Center. We're just showing a 10-minute sort of excerpt from that. But I thought it beautifully brings out how some modern poetry, and it's not Kabir and Tulsi Das that we're singing. So she has sung those modern poems of Kunwar Narain and put them into classical music. And I thought that was a very interesting experiment, a beautiful musical rendition or translation, if you will, of those poems. And finally, we leave you with a dance adaptation of a poem from the earlier collection, No Other World, called River in the Boat by Aditi Mangaldas, which is also, I thought, a very novel experiment and done in the situation of the pandemic, so with limitations of sorts. So just to announce that these are the 3 films that follow the session, and we formally close the series of events with them. Once again, thank you all for being here, being a part of this. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Apurva.
Yeah, thank you. This was wonderful.
Thank you all.
Thank you.